I'm Nina. The candles flickered in the dimly lit First Grace Church, casting a warm glow over the congregation. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the soft murmur of voices. Everyone was on their feet, clapping, as Pastor Thompson lifted the golden sash that read Community Pillar and reached towards my father's neck. My father, Mr. Harrison, stood at the front, his back straight, a proud smile on his face. My mother, Mrs. Harrison, sat in the first pew, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, beaming at the town. Then, I stood up in the back row, a thin envelope in my hand. As soon as my mother caught sight of me, her smile froze halfway to her eyes. 1 year ago, in a parking lot covered in snow, my family had handed me a suitcase and sent me away. Tonight, I was back, holding the truth in that envelope, ready to expose the lies they had built over the years. What I was about to say would change everything in a matter of minutes. To understand how I ended up standing in this church with my daughter Lily's whole life sealed in an envelope, you have to go back to a year ago, to that snow-covered parking lot and the words my mother used like a door slamming shut. A year ago, my world was a small rented apartment on Elm Street. I worked as a nurse in the local hospital, pulling long night shifts. I'd come home at dawn, the smell of antiseptic still lingering on me. There, my 8-year-old daughter Lily would be, arranging her toys in an orderly fashion, just like I liked things to be. We were content in our simple life, but there was a catch. The apartment belonged to my parents, and they never let me forget it. The rent went straight into my father's account, and every little repair was accompanied by a lecture. People at the hospital thought I had my life together, and for the most part, I did. I could handle emergencies with ease, comfort patients in their last moments, and keep accurate records. But I couldn't understand why I had to ask my parents' permission to paint Lily's bedroom. I told myself it was just how our family worked, that it was a form of love. Lily was a sweet and gentle child. She didn't ask for much, just pancakes on Sundays and for me to braid her hair slowly. Sometimes, she'd ask about her grandparents. Why we never stayed long at their house, and why there were no pictures of her in their living room. I'd just smile, change the subject, and turn up the radio. I was so focused on being the responsible one that I didn't want to face the fact that something was seriously wrong in our family. Sunday dinners at my parents' mansion were always a performance. My sister, Vivian, and her husband, Henry, who came from a wealthy family, were the favorites. The living room had a large glass cabinet where my mother displayed family achievements, Vivian's wedding portrait, her college diploma, and my father shaking hands with the mayor. But there was not a single picture of Lily. It was like she didn't exist in their world. One night, my mother set Lily's plate at the far end of the table, saying it was for more elbow room. My father barely looked at Lily. When she reached for the bread, he watched her hand as if it might contaminate the food. Lily, being the kind-hearted girl she was, still said please and thank you and complimented my mother's cooking. My mother just responded with a half-hearted "Isn't that nice?" to the air above her head. After dinner, when Lily went to wash up, my father put down his fork and said, "No grandchild of mine with that kind of look belongs here." The room went silent. My mother continued eating as if nothing had happened. I felt the urge to smooth things over, to keep the peace. But instead, I stared at the empty space in the cabinet and realized that this emptiness was a deliberate choice. I drove Lily home that night, promising myself to protect her from the harsh reality of our family. Little did I know that my promise would be tested soon. I was known in town as the reliable one. I was always there when my father needed help with the house, or when my mother's health problems flared up. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital to cover the rent of the apartment that I would never truly own. I thought this was love, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. But the truth was, I was over-responsible, and I was building my self-worth on being useful to my family. My parents were obsessed with their social standing. My mother was the president of the local garden club, and my father's business, Harrison Enterprises, was well known in the county. They believed that reputation was everything in our small town. That December, the church held its annual holiday event, and I watched as my mother paraded Vivian and Henry around, introducing them to everyone as if they were royalty. When she saw me and Lily, the introductions stopped. We were treated like invisible furniture. A woman from the garden club asked my mother if Lily was her granddaughter. My mother replied, "Nina works at the hospital," as if that was an answer, and quickly steered the woman away. Lily, holding an untouched cookie, watched the adults, learning something I didn't want her to learn. I knelt down and told her the cookies at home were better, and we left early. In the parking lot, Lily asked why Grandma talked about everyone but us. I lied and said Grandma was just busy. There was a question Lily asked me about twice a year, always at bedtime, in her soft little voice. "Mama, where's my dad?" For 8 years, I'd given her the answer I'd been told by my mother. I said her father had left before she was born and never came back. But deep down, I knew there was more to the story. The man I'd loved, Ethan, had been a steady and reliable person. He'd been finishing his engineering degree on a scholarship when we met at a local coffee shop. We dated for a year, and he met my parents once. My mother was cold and distant, and my father was overly critical. On the way back from that meeting, Ethan told me my father didn't like him. I lied and said my father didn't like anyone. When I got pregnant, I was scared but also happy. Ethan was excited and already making plans for our future. But then, 2 things happened. Ethan got a job offer overseas, and I got sick. I had to move back to my parents' house because I couldn't afford to live on my own and needed their help. The mail would come to the house, and my mother would bring it to my room every afternoon. I wrote to Ethan twice a week, asking her if there was any reply. She always shook her head and said men were unreliable under pressure. One day, she brought me an envelope with my own handwriting on it, stamped "Return to Sender," and a note saying Ethan didn't want to be tied to a baby. I called his company, but they said they couldn't share his information with me since we weren't married. I was heartbroken and decided to raise Lily on my own, believing that Ethan had abandoned us. That December, things started to change. Vivian began calling me more often, her voice tense and insistent. She said there was a family matter to discuss before the holidays and wanted me to come to the mansion without Lily. At the same time, the town was buzzing about my father. The church had chosen him for the Community Pillar Award, an honor given to the family that best represented the values of the congregation. My mother was overjoyed, and my father was walking around like he was king of the world. I was so busy with work during the holiday rush that I didn't think much of it. I called my mother to ask about the family matter. She said, "We'll talk on Christmas Eve. Don't make a fuss." The call cut off, and I told myself I'd ask in person. I tucked Lily in that night and stood in her doorway, watching her sleep, not knowing that my family was plotting against us. 2 days before Christmas, I went to the mansion for the family meeting. Lily was in the den, watching a movie. The seating arrangement told me everything. My father sat at the head of the table, my mother to his right, and Vivian across from me, with a folder in her hand. Vivian did most of the talking. She said the apartment on Elm Street was becoming a liability and that I needed to sign an agreement to vacate it and give up any claim to family property. I read the agreement twice. I asked why now. Vivian said it was just for the family's best interests. My father said the rent was too low, and they had other plans. My mother said it would be better for Lily and me to find our own place. I set the folder down and said I wasn't going to sign away Lily's future just because it was convenient. I told them I needed proper notice in writing, like any other tenant. The atmosphere in the room turned cold. Vivian's smile faded, and my father folded his hands. I gathered Lily and left. On the way home, I thought I had stood my ground, that they would back off. But I was wrong. The next morning, a letter from Harrison Enterprises was in my mailbox. It informed me that the apartment was being sold, and I had 30 days to move out. It was Christmas time, and Lily was in school. I read the letter on the porch in my scrubs, the cold seeping through my clothes. For the first time, I saw my parents' actions for what they were, a calculated move to get rid of me. I called a friend who had been through a similar situation and got the name of a tenants' rights organization. I started a file with all the relevant documents, determined to fight for our rights. That night, I sat Lily down and told her we might have to move soon. She asked if we'd still be near her school. I promised her I'd make sure of it. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, my mother called me. Her voice was warm and friendly, offering to drive Lily and me to a new place that was all set up for us. I should have been suspicious, but I was so tired and wanted to believe her. The sky was gray, and snow was falling. Lily was excited because Grandma was finally doing something with us. We got in my father's car. Lily wore her favorite red coat and carried her stuffed bear. I packed a single suitcase for both of us, thinking we'd sort things out after the holiday. As we drove away from town, I started to feel uneasy. We weren't going towards the nice apartments by the lake, instead, we were heading out of town. I asked where we were going, and my father said, "You'll see in a minute." The snow fell harder, and a knot formed in my stomach. Finally, the car stopped in front of a low-lying building with a hand-painted sign. It read Hope Shelter for Women and Children. My father parked the car. For a moment, no one moved. Then, my mother got out, opened my door, and the cold air rushed in. She took the suitcase from the trunk and set it down at my feet. Lily looked at the building and then at me, a question in her eyes. "Grandma, did we do something wrong?" she asked. My mother didn't answer. She just got back in the car, closed the door, and my father drove away. Lily started to shiver, and I knew I had to do something. I picked up the suitcase, took her hand, and walked towards the shelter. Inside, a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Johnson greeted us. She crouched down to Lily's level and told her there was hot chocolate and a play area. Lily looked at me for permission and then went with her. Mrs. Johnson then looked at me and said, "We always have room for those in need, especially on Christmas." She walked me through the intake process, not asking too many questions, just offering a kind smile. As I stood in the small, shared room, I thought about the suitcase, the red coat, and Lily's question. I knew that everything my family had done to hide Lily was about to come to an end. And then, headlights swept across the parking lot, and a car pulled in. I thought it was my parents coming back, but it wasn't. A tall man got out of the car. He was wearing a dark coat, and his face was familiar. As he walked towards the shelter, I realized it was Ethan. He looked older, more weathered, but I'd recognize him anywhere. His face was filled with anger and determination. He came into the shelter and saw Lily at the craft table. He stood there, stunned for a moment. Then he walked over to her and looked at the snowman she was making. He asked her some questions about it, and Lily, who was always drawn to kind people, immediately liked him. We sat down in a corner, and Ethan told me his story. His mother had passed away a month ago, and while going through her things, he found a box with letters I had written to him years ago. The letters were marked "Return to Sender." He started investigating and tracked me down to our town. When he found out that a family had taken a woman and a little girl to a shelter on Christmas Eve, he followed the only lead he had. We compared our stories, and the truth became clear. My mother had intercepted our letters, forged the note, and made me believe Ethan had abandoned us. Ethan showed me the letters he had written to me, all marked "refused" in my mother's handwriting. I held one of the envelopes in my hands, and I felt a cold, calm anger. I knew I had to expose the truth. Over the next few months, Ethan and I gathered evidence. We got copies of the eviction letter, the lease, and the letters marked "refused." We also found out that Vivian was in financial trouble and wanted to get rid of me to secure the family's assets. Her husband's family, the Carters, had a reputation to uphold, and they didn't know about the family's dirty secrets. I decided to wait for the right moment to expose the truth. That moment was the Christmas Eve service when my father was going to receive the Community Pillar Award. I made an envelope with all the evidence, color copies of the refused letters, the forged note, the eviction letter, and a statement from Mrs. Johnson about our arrival at the shelter. The night before Christmas Eve, Ethan asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this. He said we could just move on with our lives and forget about it. But I thought about Lily. I knew that someday she would grow up and wonder why her grandparents had treated her like an outcast. I told Ethan that I had to do this for Lily, so she would know that she was loved and that the people who tried to hide her were the ones with something to hide. On Christmas Eve, the church was filled with people. The Hales, Henry's family, sat in the front row. My parents were in the first pew, looking proud. Ethan and I sat in the back row with Lily. Mrs. Johnson slipped in and sat across the aisle. When Pastor Thompson asked my father to come forward to receive the award, I stood up. I said, "Pastor Thompson, may I say something?" The whole church went quiet. Pastor Thompson, not knowing what was about to happen, said, "Of course, Nina. This is a time for family and friends to speak." I walked up to the front of the church, holding the envelope. I said, "I want to tell you about my family's true legacy. 9 years ago, I fell in love with a good man, Ethan. My parents didn't approve of him, so they intercepted our letters and made me believe he had abandoned us. I showed the letters marked refused in my mother's handwriting. I continued, and 1 year ago, on this very night, they drove my daughter and me to a shelter and left us in the snow." Ethan stood up in the back, and I introduced him. I told the congregation how he had spent years trying to find us, hitting a wall built by my parents. Vivian tried to interrupt, saying it was a family misunderstanding. But I showed the draft of the trust she had prepared to take over the family's assets and write me out. The Hales, who had always been proud of their reputation, were shocked. Mr. Hale stood up, looked at Henry and Vivian, and walked out of the church. My father, faced with the truth, threw my mother under the bus. He said the letters were her doing. My mother, who had always been so composed, broke down. She shouted that she had done it for the family. I just looked at her and said, "You were right, Mom. This is where failures belong." In the end, the church decided not to give my father the award. The family's reputation was in tatters. The Hales ended their support for Henry and Vivian, and the trust fell apart. Ethan transferred to a job closer to home, and we rented a house on the other side of town. Lily started calling Ethan Dad, and we finally had a real family. As for my parents, I set a boundary. I told them that if they ever wanted a relationship with Lily, it had to start with the truth and happen on my terms. My father never tried, but my mother wrote Lily a letter. I read it, and it was a step towards an apology. I put it away for Lily to read when she's older. It's been a few years now. The fallout from that Christmas Eve has settled, and we've rebuilt our lives. Lily knows the whole story, and she's proud of her father and me. I've learned that a reputation is just a story, and the truth will always prevail.